That's the title of the cover of the book. And one thing I wanted to do with it, I knew a lot of people who were activists criticising where the economy was growing, was being shot down by economists saying, oh, look, you just don't understand how the economy operates. And I knew the reality was they didn't know how the economy operates, but they'd snow you with equations. And they have actually built a religion that they call economic analysis. I call them market fundamentalists, to give a better idea of where their thinking is coming from. And a lot of what they've done is absolutely absurd on any scientific basis. So they claim to be rational, but the rationality is ludicrous. Now, I want to just give a bit of a background as to why I wrote the book. Of course, when I wrote it, I'd been putting up with neoclassical economists thinking they were sane for 30 years. It's rather like being in a mental asylum where the inmates are insane and well, a bit like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I feel like Jack Nicholson before the frontal lobotomy. And one reason I wrote the book when I did was, having known that for so many years, I knew at the same time you couldn't actually have an impact unless there was a serious financial crisis around, because economics is not like engineering. If economics was like engineering, then the economy would be collapsing everywhere, and we'd know straight away the theory didn't work. But the economy is a bit like predicting whether the rotation of the Earth. You know, it's going to continue rotating, and they can take credit for the sun coming up. Well, unfortunately, they are halfway between engineers and astrologers, because they tell you what's going to happen in the future based on the model that, as Aaron was pointing out yesterday, based on Ptolemy rather than Copernicus. So they are going to be wrong at some point, and you only can convince people when they're seriously wrong and your boats start hitting rocks that aren't supposed to be there because the navigation's collapsed, because the spheres don't align with where the planets are in the real universe anymore. So in writing it, I realised that one way to describe neoclassical economics was the application of bad mathematics to wishful thinking. There are literally mathematical errors in a lot of the logic, and there are also absolutely absurd assumptions which are encapsulated in there to get over weaknesses they found when they did the mathematics properly. And what that's been used to do is to exalt what you might call the democracy of the dollar over political democracy. It's been used to reduce the realm where political action is seen as legitimate. Now, that's really saying the market is better at working out how we should allocate the wealth of our society and determine what the incomes are within that society than the body politic, which used to be how we did this before the market's economy became dominant in human social structures. And there's two preconditions for them to be right. One is that you have to have a fair distribution of income. I heard somebody mention the Gini coefficient in the States a short while ago. And that would mean if it was fair, it would reflect what you actually contributed to society. And secondly, the prices the market set would have to be accurate in the sense that you'd be in equilibrium and the prices would be correct for all the different sectors. Our inputs would be correctly priced for producing your outputs. The price would reflect the actual cost that a resource had in producing output. Now, those both been disproven by the economists who call themselves neoclassical, but disproven in such a way that it hasn't got through to the textbooks. And they've proven that productivity can't possibly determine incomes. Now, that'd be necessary for fairness to apply. But if you look at how they've put their structures together, you can very simply prove that's mathematically impossible, even within the model they've built themselves. And markets aren't stable, and they've mathematically proven that as well. Not deliberately, that was an accident because they read some maths textbooks. And I'll give a bit of background about that in the book, but Leon Walras, who first developed the idea of what he called general equilibrium, which is a model of multiple markets and multiple prices, talking about the economy being in equilibrium, it was actually quite a tour de force when he wrote it back in the 1870s, but he wasn't a mathematician, and he approached the world's best mathematician at the time, Henri Poincaré, and asked Poincaré for the endorsement of a hypothesis that Walras got to, that what he called atonement, which was people haggling prices towards equilibrium in one market, affecting prices elsewhere, so that there should be haggling in the other market as well, and maybe haggling in one market to reach equilibrium would destabilise another market. He said, well, I presume that process leads to convergence, and he asked Poincaré to endorse his expectation that it did, and Poincaré declined. Being a better mathematician, and one of the world's great mathematicians, he had enough intuition there, even though he couldn't actually analytically work it out, to think, I'm not confident that you're right, and I'm not going to endorse it. Well, about 40 or 50 years later, two mathematicians doing a very strict piece of pure mathematics, which produced what's now known as the Perron-Frobenius theorem. And that actually relates to the characteristics of matrices. It says you have a square array of all positive numbers, positives or numbers, 0 or greater than 0 numbers. Does that, when you characterize that as in terms of a direction of movement, if I had a 3 by 3 matrix, I could describe movement of an arrow through this room, okay? Now, if all the numbers in that matrix are positive, would the arrow be going towards the middle of the room or away from it? Is effectively what you're working out with this mathematics. And their answer was it'd be going towards the middle, it would be leaving the room, expanding, going away. Because what's called an eigenvalue, I'm getting technical here. Anybody, I know one person who knows what an eigenvalue is. Okay. Used to, okay. It tells you how hard something is pushing in effect. If an eigenvalue is greater than 0, the system is expanding. If an eigenvalue is negative, it's going back towards 0, which you might regard as equilibrium. And by working out the characteristics of this square array, what mathematicians call a non-trivial theorem, in other words, bloody hard to work out, they worked out the value is greater than 0. Now, when that's applied to economics mathematics, when you try to work out what market prices are, you end up with a matrix which is a square array of non-negative numbers to describe the inputs you need to produce your outputs. You can't produce outputs of corn using negative amounts of fertilizer. Okay? So all your inputs have to be either 0 or greater than 0. And they worked out, because this theorem applied, therefore the dominant eigenvalue, as it's known, was greater than 0, and that meant the price system was either the price system or the quantity system would be unstable. So that's known in mathematical economics, known as a dual stability problem. It's actually the dual instability problem, and completely glossed over in how they teach general equilibrium. They presume it's stable. It's actually proven mathematically to be unstable. Now, I've hitting you with a fair bit of verbal renditions of mathematical logic there, but that's all the sort of stuff that I knew, and just, pardon me for pressing the wrong key there, I knew, and I knew at the same time that they weren't communicating this either to their own students or the general public. And yet they were snowing the general public and saying this stuff makes sense and we can undermine all your arguments about needing political decisions about this or community involvement here or saying that wages aren't fair and so on. They're mathematically totally fallacious. So that's why I wrote the book, to make that view clear. But I also realised that I wouldn't have any traction, even though I could be correct about it, it wouldn't have any impact on really changing the discipline unless a crisis was coming along. So just to make a bit of a point about seeing this coming sometime before it happened, I wrote this in April, it was published in April 2001. I think I wrote it back in about February 2001. And I thought that we were facing a serious financial crisis back then. I expected it after the crash of the NASDAQ, but it didn't happen. I wasn't aware at the same time, as I became later, of course, that the subprime bubble was underwriting the internet bubble, and you had two bubbles at once that had to burst before you'd see a final crisis. You notice I had some awareness of peak oil there.
Could you read that for the people that can only hear it on the MP3?
Pardon? Oh, yeah, okay, sure. Whoops, pardon me, just back a bit. Okay, just the final section of saying, what I wrote back in 2001 was, I'm not wishing an economic crisis upon the modern world. Instead, I think one has well and truly been put and trained by the cumulative processes described in chapters 10 and 11. And then I take a couple of extracts from that chapter, and I talk about a crisis after the internet bubble, and that could occur in a milieu of low inflation unless oil prices, so I've always thought peak oil was a danger to cause inflation at a time where the financial dynamics would otherwise lead to deflation. And then to continue on a bit from there, I said firms are likely to react to that by dropping their margins in an attempt to move stock, and that could turn inflation into deflation, which we saw happening in 2008, and the possibility exists that America could be afflicted with a debt deflation, attenuated by an increase in government spending, and it could join Japan on the list of the global economy's walking wounded, mired in a debt-induced recession with static or falling prices and a seemingly intractable burden of private debt. Well, so much for black swans. Okay? I wasn't the only person making that argument, but that's what I proposition I put to justify why I thought it was time to write Debunking Economics. I'm rewriting a bit of it now on one particular theme, having had a couple of conference run-ins with neoclassicals recently, and I realised that there's one thing neoclassical economists don't understand. That's neoclassical And Ben Bernanke showed that recently, where he gave a lecture where he said that the economic crisis has no implications for economic theory. That the economic theory is fine, it's what he called economic engineering that wasn't working all that well. Well, it shows, I mean, I really have to have sympathy for Ben here because it shows he's had a retarded education. He's been taught neoclassical economics by neoclassical economists, and they teach out of textbooks. They do what actually a genuine science is allowed to do, and that's accept that the fundamental research they're basing their work upon is sound, and the textbooks give a reasonable rendition of that. So most physicists don't go and read Einstein's original equations on general relativity. They accept that the textbooks properly portray that, and they're correct. Okay? Einstein got it right with the theory of general relativity, and the textbooks put that across in a simplified fashion, so students learn that version of general relativity and on they can go. Equally, they don't read Max Planck's derivations that energy must come in discrete quanta. They accept that and learn quantum mechanics as it's taught in the textbooks. That's quite a valid thing to do in a genuine science. Economists do the same thing. They accept what they read in textbooks in the belief that the textbooks, and it's a justified belief, they're only 18-year-old kids when they start learning this crap. Yeah? They believe that the textbooks got it right, but the reality is they don't. Because in effect what you get is the textbooks present the theory as a perfect jewel, and it's got numerous flaws in the actual foundations. If you want to actually get a characterization in terms of jewelry, it's more a crappy piece of costume jewelry than the Hope diamond. But they end up believing it's the Hope diamond, and therefore they become zealots about putting this across to other people and convincing them. So the way that I undermine that with my own students is I get them to read the original references and not the textbooks themselves. In fact, I don't even put my own book forward as a textbook in my own courses. But it's a difficult process for people to read this stuff. So what I've done in Debunking Economics is make that rather more accessible. So I've avoided equations, and quite a few of my more mathematical readers say, can you please put some equations in there to be easier to read? Well, one of these days I might produce one for the mathematicals as well, but it's trying to put this stuff across verbally. It sold about 20,000 copies over 10 years, which isn't bad for a book that had an initial promotional budget of 300 Australian dollars. And because it's still selling, courtesy of the crisis, I've been asked to produce a second edition, which I'm working on now and I hope I'll have out next year. And to cover what is in there, of course, supply and demand, as you hear economists talk about supply and demand all the time, they can't even derive a market demand curve. What they draw in the textbooks is mathematically impossible to derive. And they found that by asking conditions of under which conditions can the individual demand curve that they can derive within their theory, can that be turned into a market demand curve? And look at how it's described in the textbook. What they proved was, this is quite weird, but they said we can derive a downward sloping demand curve for an individual consumer in one market. Can we do that for more than one consumer? And the answer was yes, they can, under two conditions. First condition, all consumers are identical. Second condition, all goods are identical. In other words, they can derive, it's proof by contradiction that they can't do it. This is exactly the same thing the Pythagoreans did when they tried to prove that the square root of 2 was a rational number and contradicted their assumptions. And by that method, developed a fantastic mathematical tool, but also showed that there are irrational numbers. Not all numbers were A over B. So what economists did, they proved that you could have a downward sloping market demand curve if and only if there was one consumer and one commodity. Therefore, you can't have a downward sloping market demand curve. Well, instead they said, oh, well, let's assume that all people are the same and all goods are the same and build our models that way. Now, of course, they don't write it that way. What they say is things like this. The marginal propensity to consume is independent of the level of income of any consumer and constant across consumers. Okay? Now, when students learn this stuff, you don't learn this stuff in first year, second year, third year, or even fourth year of an undergraduate degree. You normally do it, if you learn it at all, you learn it when you get a so-called advanced text in microeconomics, when you're doing a PhD qualifying program. Now, if you've gone that far, you're normally so brainwashed, and the real thinkers have been driven out by the mundanity of the thought, that only the autistic lot are left who are going to go through and believe this nonsense. Okay? So that's what they end up believing. And I love this. That quote from Varian is the textbook version. This is the person who first discovered it. Now, sometimes when people discover this stuff, it causes them to change their whole lives, and they leave the profession. So this actual condition is known as the Sonnenschein Mantel-Debreu conditions, and the first of those three people resigned from academia as an academic and became a bureaucrat instead, which is, I must admit, a bureaucrat is actually a more productive individual than an economist. Don't often say things like that, but that'd be true. But the guy who first wrote it showed just how deluded economists are by the way he expressed these conditions he found. Have a look at this. The necessary and sufficient conditions quoted above is intuitively reasonable. It says, in effect, that an extra unit of purchasing power should be spent the same way no matter to whom it is given. Does that sound intuitively reasonable to you? Or would you lock the bugger up? Okay.
Does he say that if you give us all $1, we're all going to spend it the same way?
Pardon? Yeah. The way I write about it in the book is to say that if Bill Gates is walking through a subway tunnel and comes across a derelict in the street begging for money, he'll get the derelict $1, and the derelict will go and buy a couple of copies of Leonardo da Vinci's Coda. And equally, if the beggar gives Bill Gates $1, Bill Gates will go and buy a bottle of methylated spirits. I mean, come on, you know. So they call that rational. Now, I've mentioned one flaw with the general equilibrium model. That's the way Volra put it together, where he was simply wondering, can you actually work out prices and equilibrium now? The other thing, for general equilibrium to apply through time, you have to actually have all those conditions being replicated, not just now at a moment in time, but to the future. Well, how do you handle that? They assume they know the future. Now, I'm not joking. This is the guy who wrote this got a Nobel Prize. This is Gerard Debreu. And he got a Nobel Prize in economics for building a mathematical model of general equilibrium, which was, by the way, totally symbolic. There was no actual attempt to actually implement this model. But have a look at this. This is how I keep on going back. This is how he... I've got to give a prelude to this because you're not going to believe it when you see it. But I'm like, I think my thing's run out of battery power. I hope this recording is working here. He has to handle the future somehow. So he brings in, how do you handle uncertainty about the future? And then he says it for a producer and for a consumer and so on. Have a look at this. For a producer, a production plan made now for the whole future is a specification of the quantities of all his inputs and all his outputs. The certainty assumption implies that he knows now what input-output combinations will be possible in the future. Okay? Then you have what he calls contingent contracts. So to get around uncertainty about the future, you have a condition on an event of, I'll wait till the text finishes appearing on the screen there. They bring in what they call contingent contracts to handle uncertainty. So the idea is you buy an umbrella at a set price in Michigan on November 14th if it's raining. But if it's not raining, you don't take delivery. Therefore, you have these contingent contracts. There's no possibility of you being surprised by any future outcome. And notice what he says down the bottom. This new definition of a commodity allows one to obtain a theory of uncertainty free of any probability concept and formally identical with a theory of certainty developed in the previous chapters. Holy hell. Okay? They've got the hide to call themselves rational and attack people who criticize them, you know. Finance markets are the same. The theory of finance, the efficient markets hypothesis, that's collapsed in the heap of the collapse of the 2008 stock market. But the theory behind that had the usual absurd assumptions that neoclassical economists like making. And here is the absurd assumption that was necessary to reach the belief that you could go from an individual investor's model to the aggregate market model. First, we assume a common pure rate of interest with all investors able to borrow or lend funds on equal terms. That's not bad, but get this. Second, homogeneity of investor expectations. Investors are assumed to agree on the prospects of various investments. Needless to say, these are highly restrictive and undoubtedly unrealistic assumptions. But he justified them on the basis that assumptions don't matter, which is this circular logic that illogic that economists got them into. Truly absurd. Now, he himself wrote at a later stage, he got the Nobel Prize for that one too, by the way. He said, what happens if we actually reject those assumptions? What happens to the theory? So the consequences of becoming such aspects of reality as people disagree over what shares are going to be worth are going to be disastrous in terms of the usefulness of the resulting theory. Okay? He said, you have the demise of all the various concepts they teach the students in the textbooks, and he finishes with a perfect punchline, the theory is in a shambles. Now, that's how nonsensical the stuff is that students get taught and swallow. And they draw these demand and supply curves. Things like this, where they have price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal. Notice they don't have time there. Okay? It's leaving dynamics out of the process completely. They'll draw this sort of stuff where you have an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. Everything happens in the intersection, whoop-de-doo. What they're actually entitled to draw, just looking at one part of the critique I take you through in Debunking Economics, is something like that. Okay? That is a valid market demand curve. Because when they said that the market demand curve has no interesting properties, what they mean is it doesn't have to slope downwards. It can slope up or down as long as it doesn't intersect with itself. Mathematically, that's the absolutely valid demand curve to derive from the theory. If you follow the logical result through that, if there's more than one consumer and more than one commodity, you won't get downward sloping demand curves. Therefore, you can get demand curves that look like that. Well, if that's the case, where's your equilibrium? Okay? Again, they work in equilibrium analysis all the time. They don't consider time dynamics and so on. They could actually do it to some extent and then show the time dynamics there, but they don't. And again, when you ask businesses what they actually do and compare it to economic theory, I love this statement from the 1930s. When businessmen had economists explain what the theory they had about production was, they viewed the economist concept of perfect competition and monopoly as virtual nonsense and the product of the itching imaginations of uninformed and inexperienced armchair theorisers. The businessman was spot on, okay? Because again, the economists had this theory that supply curves had to rise, what they call rising marginal cost. But in fact, businessmen normally argue that they design their factories in such a way that their costs of production fall as the volume rises. And the analogy I use, which probably works in a farming area here, is that what an economist would say, if you imagine this room as a farming plot, and you've got 1 kilo, well, let's say 1 tonne of fertiliser, and the proper ratio across this room might be, say, 10 tonnes of fertiliser to get the optimal amount out of it, then what they say is, well, you'll spread 1/10 of a tonne per unit, so you've got 1 tonne spread evenly over the whole room. And then if you get an extra tonne, you put another 1/10 layer and so on over the whole room. But a sensible farmer, if he knew the optimal ratio for productivity was to whack 10 tonnes across this room, they'd use 1/10 of the room for the fertiliser, leave the less fallow or use natural methods there and get a higher level of output. So even when you apply it at a farming level, their idea of diminishing marginal productivity, as they call it, doesn't make sense. And in a factory situation, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So the whole theory, what they draw is these 2 nice intersecting lines. That text is rather hard to read, but I'm saying what they're actually entitled to draw is more like a coat hanger wrapped around a stick. And they simply can't say which of those levels would be equilibrium. So the actual foundations are all crap. And we need a realistic theory in its place. And it's not that mathematics is at fault. A lot of people blame the mathematics. It's actually more a wishful thinking, as I said, bad mathematics applied to hang on to a wishful view of how market economy operates. So, and I know, having been a student who believed this stuff when I was finishing high school until halfway through first year, when the light bulb went on, you become a zealot about it. You actually become like a religious zealot. And you try to convert other people because you have a vision of a perfect society, if only you can reform it in this direction. So the reason why economists are so dangerous is they're actually trying to be good for us. Okay? They're killing us as kindness. And they end up justifying obscene inequities in income. They destroy the links that exist between peoples and firms that are far more organic than simply price-based. And they ignore the synergies between the state and markets and of course destabilise asset prices, I made that comment back in 2001, make poverty worse, all trying to make the system better. And as I saw them at the time, they were rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and actually even worse than that, they're steering and they've taken the stabilisers off the boat. So that's what they've really done. And that's why they're so dangerous. Now again, I wrote this back in 2001, 2002. So we need a truly rational economics, and it is possible. That's why I've developed the models I have to say you don't have to abandon analysis to have a vision of how a capitalist market actually functions, which can be critical of capitalism in ways that it deserves to be critical, but talk about its strengths at the same time, which is where innovation and so on come in. So that's what I'm trying to do. In the second edition, I'll be substantially rewriting some chapters. I only discovered the Sonnenschein and Mandel-Debreu conditions on demand curves when writing the book. I hadn't actually read that deeply in the literature at the time. Stunned when I found them, tried to find a way of explaining them. I've worked out a better way to explain them now. I'll talk about the efficient markets hypothesis in the past tense, as opposed to the present when I wrote the book last time round. And I'm covering alternative schools of thought in more detail. After doing my analysis of the demand curve, I also realized their theory of perfect competition was false. So their argument about supply and demand doesn't even work. Even if the supply and demand curve existed, the intersection of the two is not equilibrium for a competitive market. That was wrong. And I'll have two new chapters on the financial crisis, one going through the dynamics of credit money, as I've done with you yesterday, and 2007, talking about the crisis as well in 2007, again, more detail than I covered yesterday, but the same sort of thing. Hopefully finished in 2011. So that's the end of me for the day. Thank you.